I wanted to provide a mid-month update to share some changes I've made to the change planning model as a result of feedback I've received. In this update, I'm going to go over some outstanding questions from the last update. First, we are going to talk about the inputs into the change planning model and outputs from the change planning model that can help with project and change management in later phases. Second, I'm going to talk about some quadrant definition in an attempt to clarify the boundaries between we, it, and its. And finally, I'm going to talk about how, or even whether, level analysis belongs in the change planning model. Since we are maintaining the position of the change planning model at the front of the project, within the initiation phase, we need to start defining the inputs and outputs. I'm defining the inputs as the facilitation questions. These questions need to be defined and ordered. Currently, there are 3 identified question passes: impact, needed state, and what you have to work with to get from your current state to needed state. The outputs will be the information that will help with project and project resource planning to ensure the success of the change. The model will remain part of the initiation phase of a project. There are some outputs I see coming out of the change planning model, such as a list of existing resources and practices that support the change, a list of target changes that can be started pre-project, a list of target changes that need to be considered as part of the project, and resource and skill gaps. These outputs will require significant refinement, but this is the first pass. A significant amount of work is needed regarding inputs and outputs. First, 3 passes have been defined: input, what's needed, and what's available. The question is, will more passes be needed? Second, are these passes in the right order? Are we getting the information we need to identify the impact of the change, determine what will be needed for the change to be successful, and to best leverage the existing environment? And how much are we risking discouraging positive change because it seems too far away or too impossible or too overwhelming? Third, the experiments will help define the appropriate facilitation questions. For the outputs, we have defined the following candidates: existing supportive resources and practices, changes that we can implement now before the project starts, changes that we will need to implement as part of the project, and gaps in behavioral reinforcement, skills, and resources. We will need to see whether these are the right outputs and whether the model appropriately provides these outputs. Next, let's address quadrants and quadrant definitions. From the last draft of the model, it became clear that we needed more solid boundaries between we, it, and its. I encountered a potential approach through Alan Watkins' work, 4D leadership. I still need to test whether the model can be applied in all quadrants and what changes might need to occur to the model to move the application from one-on-one to groups to large organizations. First, I want to clarify the definitions of I, we, and the its. As we discussed in the last update, the I quadrant is focused on personal change, the mindset and behaviors required by the change. The we quadrant focuses on how I interacts with others, including the modeling the needed behaviors and any supports to encourage targeted behaviors in others. The bigger change is on the it side. Originally, I defined the upper right quadrant it as role, skills, training, and support, behavior change, and individual external issues. The lower right quadrant its was systems, tools, and processes, or collective exterior. The boundary between we and it seemed a little blurry because we can interact through roles or perform direct training, support, and mentoring. The boundary between it and its also seemed blurry since a discussion of roles also gets into organizational design. In his book 4D Leadership, Alan Watkins argues that leaders tend to focus on short-term externals. He sees this as part of the upper right quadrant. For the purposes of this model, I'm going to use Alan Watkins' separation of the IT quadrants into short-term and long-term. A candidate for further refinement is to also include small-scale and large-scale to the IT definitions. From these changes, we have two outstanding questions for the quadrants. First, what is the appropriate boundary between short-term and long-term? Second, is scale an appropriate part of the quadrant definition? If it is, then what is the appropriate boundary between small scale and large scale? I'm also in the process of experiment design around the applicability within the different levels. Experiments will appear in the Medium page, and a draft should be available by the monthly update. The final question was whether levels was overkill. After discussion with Rob Smith at Integral Life, he confirmed my suspicion that level evaluation required lengthy observation. He too questioned whether level evaluation is overkill. His advice was to think functional. As a result of this, I'm going to remove levels from the change model. The levels were meant to help predict how much cultural effort would be required for the change to succeed, and I think we can incorporate this analysis in the facilitation questions. So in summary, the execution of the change planning model will still occur in the initiation phase of the project. Inputs and outputs are in the process of being identified and defined. Quadrants have been redefined as I, we, it short-term, and it long-term. Levels have been removed from the model, and experiments are still in design. The next update to the model will occur during the monthly update at the end of September. If you have any questions or feedback on this model, please comment on this post or email me at wwickham@middlecurve.com.